Okay, so here is Learn Outcome 4, and this is all about the idea of legislation and how the law can keep our data safe within the UK and, more importantly, further afield in different countries as well. Let's just start off with legislation. So legislation is basically it's a law, it's a policy, and this has got to be passed in the House of Parliament. And this will protect companies and individuals in regards to their data and keeping their data safe and secure. The first one that we're going to talk through is going to be Data Protection Act. Now, this has recently changed into something called the GDPR, which was come out last year. In the spec, it does say still the Data Protection Act from 1998, and there's 8 principles in this. The latest one is pretty much the same, so that's just going to be your further reading, just to read up on them facts about the GDPR. There is the 8 principles. So obviously it starts off: data must only be used in a fair and lawful way, right the way round to data should not be transferred abroad without protection. Now, that's the part that I'm going to go through. This is obviously a lot of these points are pretty self-explanatory, pretty easy to understand. So, for instance, data should be kept safe and secure by using passwords, encryption, all them kind of things. Now, when we start looking into the Data Protection Act, this act basically gives the data subjects the right to see their personal data. So basically, if a company has data about you, you can ring up and say, I want to see the data that you have got on me, and they by law have got to show you your data that they store. Okay, now there are obviously some exceptions, such as national security, or if there's any sort of outcomes to some court cases, that will obviously need to be done in more of a professional and formal manner. Next one I'm going to go through is the Freedom of Information Act. And this was in 2000, and this basically allows members of the public to request to see information held by a public organisation. The way I always explain this is the Hillsborough disaster. That was all the details of them cases were let out into the public domain because the public requested, and they signed petitions to actually get the government and the police to release that information. Then it started all the inquests in and around the Hillsborough disaster. Computer Misuse Act, that started in 1990, apologies, and this was designed to stop hacking and cybercrime basically, and there was 3 steps. Now, the first one is gaining unauthorized access to a private network, mainly through hacking. Gaining unauthorized access in order to commit a crime, so for instance stealing data or destroying a network. This could be done by a number of different ways, mainly hacking, but the second one might be sort of using some social engineering techniques. And then the last one there says unauthorized modification of files, so in other words we can't or you can't log into somewhere external that you are not meant to be and change data to maybe give you a personal benefit or something like that. The next one is copyright. Copyright started in 1988, and this basically protects your intellectual property. Now, intellectual property basically means anything that you have made. Copyright covers songs, software, inventions, books, films, video games, and it's obviously illegal to copy or share copyrighted files without permission. Now, I must stress on this, even if something is copyrighted doesn't mean you can't share it. You just need to ask permission from the author, from whoever made it, and for you then to share it. If you don't ask them for permission, they could potentially sue you. Now, there's a lot of different sort of red tape in and around this, because loads of different, say for instance, song artists use parts of other people's songs and stuff, and then it does turn a little bit nasty in court. Now, this idea of copyright you just need to understand that if you make something, it is automatically copyrighted to you. Okay, and if somebody wants to use it, then they need to ask you for permission. And if you say yes, but I want £1,000, they've got to pay you £1,000 for them then to use your information or your invention or book or whatever. But the issues with copyright is the internet makes it harder to track. So for instance, stuff like torrent sites, these torrent sites are popped up everywhere, and these will share illegally information for people's benefits. They will also sell stuff like, they will also release stuff like songs, movies that are out in the pictures, all them kind of things, and it's really hard for us to track it. That's in the UK. Some places across the world don't have them laws, which means the copyright law does not exist, which basically means that these torrent sites are able to work in these other foreign countries. Okay, so the Creative Commons licenses allows you to legally share media and software online without having to ask for permission. This is basically open source software that allows you to change the software, manipulate the software to make it better for you if you are working for a company. There is the 4 different licenses and what the conditions are of each one. Okay, so I'm just going to pause there. It's pretty self-explanatory, just for you to read it. Okay, RIPA, which stands for the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act. This act basically covers public bodies to carry out investigations and surveillances. So basically, if you think somebody is doing something illegally, then we can basically investigate. We can check them out from afar. We can listen into their communications. We can do anything at all. And this is basically is used by the police. Okay, so the Private and Electronic Communication Regulation. Now this governs the way organisations can use electronic communications to contact customers. Now, in and around this, a lot of this is basically in small print. Okay, so if you sign up for, say, a website or sign up for a company, a lot of people won't read the small print, and then you just click yes, I accept. Basically, the core theme around this is basically the privacy of your information. So, for instance, spam emails or phone calls that you get trying to sell you stuff. This all comes in and around this, and what they do is they will buy your details off an external firm where you have already signed up to yourself and pressed yes, I agree to these terms. Okay, the ICO. These codes of practice basically interpret the Data Protection Act and apply them to specific practices. So what this will actually do is like there it says, for example, there's a code of practice for the use of CCTV. Okay, and a prime example of that is something called ANPR, which is again used by the police, and that CCTV will just track number plates, and they will track according to the DVLA database to check to make sure the car's insured, there's a qualified driver behind the wheel, it's taxed, it's MOT'd, all these kind of things. And the Equality Act, so this basically means that everyone in the UK is treated exactly the same, okay, and that means it stops discrimination. Now, over the course of the past few years, the Equality Act has actually come into play a lot more. There's been a lot more people aware of it. So, for instance, people discriminating against gender, age, and there's been quite a few high-profile cases on this, and it's all come down to this Equality Act and understanding that that it actually it's there. Discrimination is still in our society, but it is diminishing by the year, probably. Okay, the next part is global legislation. So all that legislation I've just spoke about is all about UK legislation. This is now the global legislation, okay? And the Data Protection Act in most places will exist, and the eighth principle of the Data Protection Act says if we want to share information outside of this country, it needs to be secure basically with all stakeholders. Now that word stakeholders basically means everybody involved. So for instance, the two companies and the person or thing or item involved. Now the data protection laws need to be sufficient in the other country for the UK to allow that data to be sent. Some countries actually don't have these laws in place, which basically means that the UK will not share or give that country certain specific pieces of data, because the laws around it to make sure it's correct, to make sure that it is kept safe, is not sufficient enough for the UK to allow that data to go out. It might cause national security threat. It might also simply just cause someone to get maybe hacked from another country, and in terms of bank details, for instance, as an example, might actually get stolen. Okay, so the USA have actually set up something called the Safe Harbour Scheme, which basically means that if complied with, gives sufficient protection for UK data to be stored and processed in the USA. Now, if the organisation is not set up with the scheme, the UK cannot be stored there. The UK data cannot be stored there. So, for instance, if an airline is not in this Safe Harbour Scheme, then sort of airline and planes will not be able to land because the USA can't store the database. The USA can't store the information in that database. So again, it's that idea of working together, making sure that if you're in the same scheme, you're following the same rules, same policies, and in effect making sure that our information is kept safe and secure. Okay, UNCRPD, which is basically the UN Conventions on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And this basically gives people with disabilities the same access as anybody else to using the internet, basically. Okay, so for instance, if somebody's blind, there will actually be alt tags on the image. So when people actually hover over these images, you will actually be able to get a verbal explanation back off there in terms of what the image is, just so people can understand what the image is that they are using on the actual computer itself. Now this needs to happen on all main websites as part of this the UNCRPD law. And the last thing that we're going to go through is going to be green IT. Okay, but what is it? Okay, so green IT are initiatives that take all technology companies need to abide by, basically. Okay, and they need to make sure they are creating a very little carbon. Okay, so this thing called carbon footprint. Okay, it's basically the amount of carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere as a result of activities of a particular individual, organisation or community. So if you think of, say, mobile phone companies, for instance, these need to make sure that these are working as green as possible to make sure that we don't harm our environment. Now, this is obviously in the UK, but also it's a worldwide issue, and these things do take priority in terms of the world leaders. What's the purpose of it? Okay, so if green IT is successful, then the negative impact of IT is reduced. Okay, and the climate benefits. So we all know the benefits of IT, we all understand it, but if we are producing it and it is harming our environment, then again it might be doing more wrong than good. Okay, this basically means that we need to reduce the emissions that lead to climate change, okay, and should reduce the pressure in our ecosystem in a nutshell. Now, when we start looking at different companies, I know Apple stores, for instance, they run, the actual stores themselves, they run on 98.7% renewable energy. So in other words, they are not using anything else other than renewable energy from, say, wind turbines or maybe from solar panels or these kind of things. But there is a global requirement, okay, and it doesn't matter where it is. All companies, all people need to make sure that they make computing more eco-friendly. So that might be stuff like not creating any landfills, making sure that if we are basically getting rid of certain pieces of technology, that it gets recycled in a correct and easy manner. Making sure that as much of the device is used as possible as part of the global requirements. Okay, so the United Nations Climate Change Summits, and these are basically annual meetings to discuss climate change. This is where a load of leaders in the whole of the world will sit down, and their focus has been purely on the reduction of the carbon footprints across the world, and in doing so making sure that consider the use and disposal of computers and computing equipment. So like I said before, making sure that any IT equipment that's used, it's just not buried, it's taken apart, it's completely reduced in terms of the amount of waste that is from that computer. So for instance, I know in the CPU there's gold that'll just get disintegrated off, and that'll be put to one side and remade for something else. Might be for jewellery, might be for other things. So again, all these kind of things need to be taken into consideration when we start looking at climate change. So the UK government policy, okay, so the UK government policy, this is called the Greening Government ICT strategy, and this basically commits to making sure that the use of cloud storage and shared services were identified as areas in which we could reduce its carbon footprint. So instead of us having local hard drives, it's now putting a push on using shared cloud storage. So again, we're using less devices, we're using less hardware in terms of our country, which then means we're not going to be throwing away a lot of unused sort of computer parts. So again, the key principles around this are to basically engage with its suppliers. So for instance, the big companies such as Apple and Samsung and LG and all these kind of companies, to make sure that they reduce their greenhouse gases, okay, and basically to make sure that, see that word there on the last bullet point where it says redundant ICT is reused. Whereas if something's redundant, it's not needed anymore. So old phones, tablets, these companies will pop up and they will use them. They will buy your old phones off you, and they will reduce the waste. But they could either sell that phone back on, or take the bits out and then try and make make one unit out of maybe 2 or 3 broken units. Again, it's all this idea around making sure that the country is sustainable, making sure that we do reduce our carbon footprint, and to make sure that everyone is pulling in the right direction.